It's patriotism over globalism. U.S. President Donald Trump delivered his speech loud and clear to the UN General Assembly on Tuesday. His bragging attracted some chuckles, but not everyone is laughing. What key messages did Trump fixate on this year? And Trump signed his first new bilateral trade deal with the Republic of Korea on Monday. What's the significance as Trump's multi-front trade war brews? Welcome to The Point. I'm Michael Wong, sitting in for Liu Xin. Well, in his speech to the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly on Tuesday, U.S. President Donald Trump covered a spectrum of issues ranging from global security, trade, and above all, the U.S.'s idea of sovereignty. Now, he reaffirmed his commitment to America First policies by rejecting globalism in favor of patriotism. Now, in response to what critics have called the U.S.'s isolationist foreign policy, Trump slammed international bureaucracy, announcing that the U.S. will press ahead with further sanctions on Iran and keep sanctions on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, until denuclearization occurs. So, what kind of sovereignty and independence is the U.S. seeking? What exactly did President Trump mean when he said every country is on its own? And how is the international community reacting to President Trump's speech and his America First policies? Joining me for the discussion in our Beijing studio are Rick Dunham, a former White House correspondent and also the co-director of the Global Business Journalist Program at Tsinghua University. Also, Mr. Zhao Hai, research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, at the beginning of his speech to the United Nations, President Trump first got some laughs, some snickers instead of applause after bragging about his administration's achievements. Let's listen in to that first.
Today I stand before the United Nations General Assembly to share the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
So, you heard some chuckles over there, gentlemen. Mr. Zhao, I want to start with you. What do you think about those laughs?
I think those laughs are just natural response to his speech. I think the people, those people sitting in the audience are diplomats and politicians from all over the world. But these people are also normal people. When listening to Trump bragging about his achievements during the first 2 years of his presidency, without the facts backing it up, people are naturally respond with laughter. So I think this is just a very natural response. However, I think more significantly, this laughter happened in the beginning of his speech. For the rest of his speech, nobody applauded. So that silence, I think, speaks volume about global communities respond to his speech, to the ideas contained in that speech. So I think that's more important because media focuses more on people laughing at him, and that's a response probably in the mainstream media in the United States. But I think the whole speech takes a longer time and is more significant when people sitting down there keep their silence.
Gotcha. And Rick, what do you think this is going to do to President Trump's pride, you think?
Well, he doesn't like people to laugh at him. But from the point of view of the people who are in the audience, they may think that he's a joke, but his policies are deadly serious. And I mean, I do think that they were listening to what he was saying. I think that U.S. allies are probably as concerned as U.S. adversaries because Donald Trump's whole talk of sovereignty tears apart the traditional post-World War II alliances and the economic framework that has followed the Second World War. And I think that especially the EU is very concerned, and North American allies like Canada and Mexico.
And how would you evaluate his reaction to those laughs?
Well, actually, he didn't lose his cool. He looked like a TV host, and he rolled with the punches. Now, what I really want to know is what happens when he gets back to Trump Tower and he's sitting there with his smartphone trying to decide whether to tweet or not. I mean, I think we'll find out in the morning whether he's really upset or not.
Gotcha. And also at his UN General Assembly speech, President Trump said, and I quote here, "America will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance, control, and domination, and that the U.S. will not tell you how to live or work or worship. We only ask you that you honor our sovereignty in return. Rick, I want to come back to you again. You know, when it comes to U.S. global governance, right, in terms of also perhaps interfering in the Middle East and economic sanctions on various countries, is there maybe some sort of irony here when President Trump says this?
Well, I would say less irony than sort of hollow rhetoric. I mean, what country would be against independence when compared to global governance or global dictation of policy? I mean, to me, those are hollow words. The words to me that were serious were when he talked about globalism, an end of globalism, and giving the world a dichotomy, either globalism or patriotism, because I think that's a false dichotomy. That's a false choice. You can be patriotic and globalist at the same time.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. Certainly. Mr. Zhao, who's infringing on U.S. sovereignty, as Mr. Trump has said? Is anyone infringing on American sovereignty?
I think there's the inconsistency, or there's an irony contained in this message, because first of all, if you remember a couple of days back when the anonymous op-ed in the New York Times talking about two-track presidency, and you listen to President Trump giving his speech, there's really two parallel messages. On the one hand, Trump emphasized on sovereignty, on U.S. keeping its independence, but on the other hand, he's speaking about interfering into other countries' domestic politics, which is very much disrespect of sovereignty of other countries. So that whole message is that U.S. may have its sovereignty, but other countries may not. So this is very inconsistent. On the other hand, when he talked about losing sovereignty and other people interfering in Americans' domestic politics, he talked about probably Russians' interference, allegedly interference in U.S. elections, and also other countries' unfair trade deals with the United States. In his eyes, that's the concession made by the U.S. to other countries, giving money to other countries. So I think overall, he's talking about protecting U.S. self-interest, but instead of global interest, instead of global governance. And this word, globalism, is really created by, I think, the alternative right and the right wings in the U.S. To blemish people supporting globalization and benefited from the globalization. So I think this is not the right word to describe, and as Rick has mentioned, this dichotomy is not real. It's not real. So I think in many ways we should really fight against this idea that globalism is against patriotism. Both can exist at the same time.
Can work together. Okay, and when it comes to economic sanctions, of course, we saw more sanctions on Iran, and President Trump has spoken about more sanctions after November for Iran in his UNGA speech. When it comes to the DPRK, despite diplomatic progress that we've seen on the Korean Peninsula, we're not going to see sanctions lifted unless we see denuclearization on the peninsula. So when it comes to these sanctions, how do you think this is going to be legitimate under sort of the overall UN framework? Is it legitimate, Rick?
Well, I think you have to unwrap the sanctions one basket at a time. With Iran, I mean, it's legitimate in that the U.S. has any right to put sanctions on for its own foreign policy reasons, but the U.S. in some ways is a pariah nation because it had signed a treaty, an agreement with Iran. Iran has upheld its end of the treaty, and now the U.S. has gone back on its word. So that's a problem. When it comes to North Korea, it's different. I think that this is a negotiating tool because there's no agreement, and to get an agreement for phased denuclearization, you have to keep the pressure on. So I think that that's a different situation, and the whole world still stands behind the UN sanctions until there is tangible progress.
Gotcha. So when it comes to, I guess, the U.S. perhaps reneging on the Iran nuclear deal, can any country then trust this administration in particular going forward in terms of economic sovereignty for their own particular country?
No, I think moving forward, particularly with the current composition of his administration, nobody can really trust the current administration to really keep it worse and keep a deal. So I think in terms of Iran deal, there's some particular interesting things. Compared to the DPRK, actually DPRK's nuclear program, the missile program, is much more advanced than Iran, and Iran actually signed agreements with other countries, and they kept their deal. So I think there are other factors at work here, particularly when Trump praised Israel, Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, and the U.S. actually allied with those two countries, and they are the countries are pushing and particularly influencing the American foreign policy against Iran. So I think that's one of the factors we have to consider.
Gotcha. And when it comes to sort of balancing the America First policy with sort of globalism as well as patriotism, where do we stand on that, Rick? Because we see the U.S. pulling out of a lot of international organizations, right? The Human Rights Council and Paris Climate Change. So where does this balance stand, you think?
Well, to me, I start as a historian, and going back to America First was the slogan of the pro-Nazi isolationists before the Second World War. And so it has a connotation in America of retreating from the world. I mean, I think that Donald Trump wants to take apart multilateral organizations. He is a believer in bilateral negotiations because he believes he's a strong negotiator, and he believes the U.S. is a stronger economy than any other country. To me, this is the antithesis of what we've seen from America in both parties since the Second World War. I mean, America has been a leader, whether you agree with America or not, of multinational organizations, and has been a leader of global alliances. And so I think this is uncharted territory if Donald Trump continues the direction he's going in.
Yeah. And Mr. Zhao, in terms of China's position on, I guess you don't like the word globalism, right? So in terms of multilateralism, give us a sense of where China's stance is on this right now.
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that America, after World War II, was the builder and benefiter of the current global system. So I think we have to make that clear, because now there's only a group of people in the United States who are not benefited directly from this system. Those people are rebelled against the current system, supported Trump, and Trump now represent them trying to take this system apart. And China, particularly after opening up and reform, has been contributing to this current system and also benefited from the current system. So in terms of global governance, China is trying to contribute more and maintain the current system as stable and as prosperous as possible. So I think in this respect, China contrasts very vividly with the United States at all kinds of global organizations, particularly the United Nations.
And also at the UNGA speech, President Trump talked about China's trade imbalances with the United States, saying that China was engaging in market distortion. What's your response to that?
Well, he and his administration should go back and read China's white paper. I mean, China has laid out every rebuttal to the American argument against the free trade with China, and also I think point by point China has made it clear that both countries benefited from the free trade between the two countries, and nobody is unilaterally benefited and the other side suffered. So it's a win-win situation, not a win-lose situation. If the United States continue the current trade war with China, it's going to be a lose-lose situation, and no doubt about it.
Yeah, okay. Well, we are going to leave the conversation right there. Certainly lots more to talk about in the days ahead. Many thanks for your time on this. Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, as well as Mr. Zhao Hai, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Many thanks for that. All right, we are going to take a short break, and when we come back, President Trump has scored his first new bilateral trade deal. Is his new deal with the Republic of Korea a breakthrough in his trade war? Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, U.S. President Donald Trump signed a revamped trade deal with the Republic of Korea President Moon Jae-in on Monday. The meeting took place on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. It marks President Trump's first bilateral trade agreement after lambasting and ending existing pacts in an effort to overhaul the U.S.'s trade relationships. Now, the new version of the United States-Korea Free Trade Agreement, known as KORUS, specifically aims to boost U.S. auto sales to the Republic of Korea, but some analysts are wondering just how impactful these changes may be. So, will this deal set a precedent for more U.S. wins in its multi-front trade war? And by accepting President Trump's terms, what might the Republic of Korea lose economically but gain diplomatically when it comes to peace efforts on the Korean Peninsula? Joining me for the discussion in the Beijing studio are Professor John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics, as well as Jörg Meyer, a Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And from Seoul, Jae-min Lee, Professor of Law at the School of Law at Seoul National University. Welcome to all. Professor Lee, I want to begin with you. The chorus has been around since 2012, but in April of last year, President Trump called the free trade agreement a, quote, horrible deal that has destroyed America. Now, the U.S. and South Korea are major trading partners and exchanged nearly $155 billion in goods and services last year. So why did President Trump see the existing agreement as such a threat?
Well, Michael, right. The concern from the U.S. government over the Korea-U.S. FTA has been largely about its trade deficit in the automobile sector. And that concern has led to the reopening of Korea-U.S. FTA, which is now signed again by the two presidents yesterday. So it all started with U.S. concern of its trade deficit in goods trade with Korea, which was at $22.8 billion in 2017, mainly in the automobile sector. So the focus of the trade renegotiation of Korea-U.S. FTA this time was focused on its automobile, the discussion on automobile sector.
Gotcha. And back here in Beijing, Professor Gong, I want to ask you, so Professor Lee talked about, in terms of one difference, might be some updates on the automotive sector. What else do we see that is different in this update of the U.S.-South Korea trade deal?
Well, another big deal in this trade agreement is South Korea's voluntary reduction of exports of steel to the United States, down to 70%, a self-imposed limitation. And in exchange for that, Donald Trump has exempted South Korea from that Section 203 investigation tariff, that is the 10% on steel. South Korea is a big exporter of steel to the U.S., and I think that's quite significant from the South Korean side. I want to make a point about this auto thing, though. I mean, even if that the U.S. in this agreement, U.S. is allowed to export up to 50,000 automobiles for each company. To one of the two companies in the U.S. But there's a cost associated with that. That is that the South Korea has sacrificed its standard. It allows a American safety standard to be applied in the South Korean market. I don't understand how President Moon is going to explain to the Korean people, because he's going to let another foreign standard, not meeting South Koreans' automobile safety standard, to have these cars running on streets of Seoul. That's quite extraordinary to me. I don't understand how to explain that. Usually, for foreign cars into a country, you have to go through a homologation process. That means that the cars have to comply to the local standards in a particular country. In this case, it totally gives up. So that's something something I don't quite understand.
Hold that thought. We might come back to that in just a moment, because I guess in any deal you have to give a little and take a little. Mr. Meyer, I want to come to you because in a speech, President Trump said, quote, many nations in this hall will agree that the world trading system is in dire need of change. Do you agree with that statement? I mean, dire need of change is quite a dramatic way of putting things.
That is certainly quite a dramatic way of putting things. You are quite right. But I think to some extent President Trump has a point. Because if you think about the results of free trade, I think that many people are disillusioned. Because it has worked for some, but it has not worked for many. If you think about the increase in inequality worldwide, across nations, but also within nations, I think that trade has played a role. And I think we have President Trump as a president only because many Americans feel that they have been left behind on multilateralism, on the trading system. But I think it is not just American workers in the Midwest, because I think there's a general disillusionment with the way of multilateralism is working, or rather globalization is working. If you think of Brexit, if you think of right-wing nationalist movements all across Europe, I think there's a certain worry
about the system not working well. And we've always heard there's no alternative. And to an extent, the positive point about all of what Mr. Trump is doing is showing, yes, there is an alternative. Now, we think that the alternative he's offering with the bilateral agreements is not the right way of going, but we suggest to go for a progressive multilateralism that takes account of the needs of workers, also of labor, an increase in labor share as a goal, for example.
Gotcha. And Professor Gong, what do you think about sort of the United States dismantling existing free trade agreements and going at it itself? What is the impact of that on the global economy and global trade going forward?
I think he is going to basically destroy the current world order, economic order. And now we are getting into a world where everybody is fighting for their own interests. It's going to be a beggar thy neighbor kind of a situation for everyone. You know, he thinks that the United States economy is strong, it's still the largest economy in the world, and he has this sort of, you know, hub and spoke philosophy when it comes to dealing with foreign countries in trade. He wants to negotiate from his position of strength, he thinks, on an individual basis for each country. And this is a scenario that I think is going to be of great concern to many countries around the world, especially countries in Europe, and of course China included as well.
Yeah.
And I think some of his U.S. allies in Asia, small economies like Taiwan, like Singapore, and other Southeastern Asia countries, they probably have to contemplate the scenario that they will have to deal with the United States down the road. And we're going to go down that path, and everyone has to go to Washington and negotiate each deal with Donald Trump. It's going to be a tough job for everyone.
Gotcha. Okay, Professor Lee, I want to come back to you because I want to take a closer look at the specifics of this deal, starting with the auto industry, like you mentioned earlier. As we mentioned, under this new deal, for example, each American auto exporter can now send up to 50,000 vehicles annually to South Korea. That meets U.S. safety standards, of course, rather than Korean safety standards. This is to double sort of the amount of the current quota, but U.S. automakers aren't even coming close to selling 25,000 cars to South Korea per year. So give us a sense of just how helpful is this new deal to U.S. car makers?
Right. As you just said, the original under the original Korea-U.S. FTA, it was 25,000 units per year, but now it has been doubled to 50,000 units per manufacturer per year. But as you just pointed out, each manufacturer of the United States is now selling less than 10,000 units in Korean market. So it's not likely that any of them will reach the 50,000 mark in the near future. So I do not think that there will be any practical impact on the U.S. automakers in the Korean market. But that said, Michael, it's very symbolic. So the United States has been making a lot of efforts in making inroads to the Korean automobile market, and if their efforts continues, then it may be possible in the future that they will reach the 25,000 mark and then 50,000 mark until that time. By that time, if that time reaches, then there will be a practical impact from the trade deal this time. But until that time, I think the practical aspect of the negotiation is just still not so clear at this point.
In that case then, Professor Lee, you just mentioned that this might be sort of more symbolic. So in terms of the trade deficit that the U.S. has with South Korea, is that going to shrink at all or by much for next year?
Right. Yes. As a matter of fact, the South Korea's trade surplus with the United States is already shrinking. So last year, 2017, South Korea's surplus was 22.8, nearly 23 billion US dollars. But it is estimated that this year, in 2018, it will be just about $13 billion, which is almost half from last year. So the impact of the pressure from the United States is already taking place in Korea. So that is not with respect to the automobile sector, but it's about the overall trade balancing between the two countries. So the impact of U.S. effort to reduce trade deficit with Korea is already taking effect, at least as South Korea is concerned.
Gotcha. And Mr. Meyer, you know, Mr. Trump is sort of fighting multiple fronts on his trade war with the world. Do you think this is sort of, in terms of the right tactic towards saving American jobs?
No, I don't think it is, and I think especially trying to address imbalances in trade through tariffs is the wrong way of going, because trade imbalances are a macroeconomic phenomenon. So if the U.S. wants to reduce its deficit, it should do something about investment savings balance. And I think that the tariffs war will in fact lead to a lose-lose situation, as was mentioned before here. And all of these bilateral agreements will eventually lead to a jungle of a trade system, and that one will lose out about global public good. And I think that saving multilateralism is the only way forward.
Gotcha. And we've got about 1 minute left, so Professor Gong, I want to end with you. You know, President Trump saying that this trade deal with South Korea is just the beginning. Do you think sort of this is a new way for countries to look at how this administration deals with trade pacts going forward?
I think he's got his first success, and he is going to continue down that path. He is going to take the same approach to many other countries. It looks that he is very close to closing the deal with Mexico. And I think there's a likelihood that he will probably close the deal with Canada. And so with these three countries in the bag, I think Donald Trump is more confident, and he will continue to take this approach in negotiating with other countries. So I think that doesn't mean he's going to succeed, especially with respect to China, I guess. So we'll wait and see if this approach can indeed be a success, and whether the United States is going to take a revolutionary approach to world trade. We'll just see.
And really quickly, Mr. Meyer, I want to end with you in terms of potentially a deal between China and the United States. Where do you see that happening in terms of a timetable, and what needs to happen for that to happen?
Well, for now, at least in the short term, I don't really see any I don't expect anything for the near future. But I think there could be a deal once perhaps the imbalance is shrinking. The deficit with China of U.S. trade is shrinking, but perhaps for the wrong reason, like that it would lead the tariff war to a decline in investment, which would lead to a decline in growth, and therefore to a decline in imports. So eventually President Trump may actually attain his goal, but the wrong way.
Gotcha. Okay, some interesting insights tonight. Many thanks, gentlemen, for your analysis on this front. Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, as well as Jörg Meyer, a Senior Economic Affairs Officer with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time on this. And that's all for this edition of The Point here on CGTN. I'm Michael Wong in Beijing. We'll see you again, same time tomorrow.